St. John's Gospel, chapter 11. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had been in the tomb 4 days already. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, so many of the Jewish people of the region had come to Martha and Mary to console them over the loss of their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will grant you." Jesus replied, "Your brother will come back to life again." Martha said, "I know he will come back to life again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even if he dies, and the one who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She replied, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who comes into the world." When she had said this, Martha went and called her sister, saying privately, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." So when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still in the place where Martha had come to meet him. Then the people who were with Mary in the house consoling her saw her get up and move quickly, going out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. But when Mary came to the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the people who had come with her weeping, he was intensely moved in spirit and greatly distressed. He asked, "Where have you laid him?" They replied, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. Thus the people who had come to mourn said, "Look how much he must have loved him." But some of them said, "This is the man who caused the blind man to see. Couldn't he have done something to keep Lazarus from dying?" Jesus, intensely moved again, came to the tomb. Now it was in a cave, and a stone had been placed across the entrance. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the deceased, replied, "Lord, by this time the body will have a bad smell, because he has been buried 4 days. Jesus replied, "Didn't I tell you that if only you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" And so they took away the stone. Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have listened to me. I know you always listen to me, but I said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The one who had died came out, his feet and hands tied with strips of cloth, and a cloth wrapped around his face. Jesus said to them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Then many of the people who had come with Mary and seen the things that Jesus did believed in him. But some returned to the Pharisees and reported to them what Jesus had done. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In this 11th chapter, it is related how the death of Jesus was finally determined upon on the occasion of his raising Lazarus. The 10 chapters preceding have served to indicate how Jesus revealed himself to the Jews in every aspect that was likely to win faith, how each fresh revelation only served to embitter them against him, hardening their unbelief into a hopeless hostility. In these few pages, John has given us a wonderfully compressed but vivid summary of the miracles and conversations of Jesus, serving to reveal his true character and work. Jesus has shown himself as the light of the world, and yet the darkness did not understand him, as the shepherd of the sheep, but they will not listen to his voice, as the life of men, but they will not come to him to have life, as the impersonation of the love of God to come to dwell among men, sharing their sorrows and their joys. But the men hate him even more. The more love he shows, the more they hate. As the truth that could make men free, they choose to serve the father of lies and to do his work. And now, as he reveals himself as the resurrection and the life, possessed of the key which is inaccessible to any other, of the power most essential to man, they resolve upon his death. There is something appropriate about this. His love for his friends drew him back at the risk of his life to the neighbourhood of Jerusalem. It is as if, to his eye, Lazarus represented all of his friends, and he feels constrained to come out of his safe retreat at the risk of his own life, and deliver them from the power of death. That this was in the mind of Jesus himself is clear. When he expressed his resolve to go to his friends in Bethany, he used an expression which shows that he anticipated danger, which at once suggested to his disciples that he was running a great risk. Let us go, not to Bethany, but into Judea again. His disciples said to him, Master, the Jews lately sought to stone you, and yet you want to go there again. The answer of Jesus to this protest is significant. Are there not 12 hours in the day? That is to say, has not every man his allotted time to work, his day of light, in which he can walk and work, and which no danger or calamity could ever shorten? Can men make the sun set an hour earlier or an hour later? Neither can they shorten by 1 hour the day of life, of light, and toil that your God has appointed to you. Wicked men may grudge that God's sun shines on the fields of their enemies and prospers them, but their envy cannot darken nor shorten the course of the sun. So many wicked men grudge that I work these miracles and I do these deeds of my loving Father, but I am as far above their reach as the sun in heaven, and until I have run my appointed course, their envy and anger is impotent. The real danger begins when a man tries to prolong his day, to turn night into day, and the danger begins when a man through fear turns aside from duty and then loses the only true guide and light in his life. A man's knowledge of duty, or God's will, is the only true light he has to guide him in life. That duty God has already measured, to each man his 12 hours. Only by following duty into all hazards and confusion can you live out your full term. If, on the other hand, you try to extend your term, you find that the sun of duty has been set already, and you have no power to bring light back to your path. A man may indeed preserve his life on earth for a year or two by declining dangerous duties, but his day is done, and he is henceforth only stumbling about on the earth in the outer cold and darkness. He had better by far have gone home to God and been quietly sleeping, Better by far to have acknowledged that his day was done and his night coming, not striving to wake up and work on. If, through the fear of danger, through straitened circumstance of serious inconvenience, you refuse to go where God, i.e., where duty calls you, you make a terrible mistake. Instead of thereby preserving your life, you lose it. Instead of prolonging your day of usefulness, brightness, and comfort, you lose the very light of life, and stumble on thereafter through life without a guide, making innumerable false steps as the result of that first false step, in which you turned in the wrong direction. Not dead indeed, but living as the very ghost of your former self on this side of the grave, miserable, profitless, and cursed. John, it seems, had two reasons for recording this miracle. Firstly, because it exhibited Jesus as the resurrection and the life, and secondly, because it more distinctly separated the whole body of the Jews into believers and unbelievers. But there are two small points which we might consider before we turn to the main theme. First, we read that when Jesus saw Mary weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in spirit and was troubled before weeping himself. But why did he show such emotion? The Jews who saw him weep supposed that his tears were prompted, as were their own, by a selfish sorrow for their loss and sympathy for the sisters. To see a woman like Mary throwing himself at his feet, breaking into a passion of tears and crying with an intense regret, if not with that tinge of reproach, "Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died," was enough to bring tears to the eyes of harder natures than our Lord's. But the care with which John describes the disturbance of his spirit, the emphasis he lays upon his inward groaning, the notice he takes of the account of the Jews give of his tears, all seem to indicate that something more than ordinary grief or sympathy was the font of these tears, the cause of the distress which could vent itself only in audible groans. He was, indeed, in sympathy with the mourners and felt for them, but there was that in the whole scene with which he had no sympathy. There was none of that feeling he required his disciples to show at his own death, no rejoicing that one more had gone to the Father. There was a forgetfulness of the most essential facts of death, an unbelief which seemed entirely to separate the crowd of wailing people from the light and the life of God's very presence. It was the darkness between God and his creation that gave room for and was filled with their weeping and wailing over their dead. It was the deeper anguish into which mourners are plunged by looking upon death as extinction, and by supposing that death separates from God and from life, instead of taking us closer to God and more abundant life. It was this which caused Jesus to groan. He could not bear the evidence that even the best of God's children do not believe in God as greater than death, and in death as being ruled by God. This thought gives us the key to Christ's belief in immortality, to all sound belief in immortality. It was Christ's sense of God, his uninterrupted consciousness of God, his distinct knowledge that God, the loving Father, is the existence in whom all live. It was this which made it impossible for Christ to think of death as extinction or separation from God. For one who had consciously lived in God, to be separated from God was impossible. For one who was bound to God by love, to drop out of that love into nothingness or desolation was inconceivable. His constant and absolute sense of God gave him an unquestioning sense of immortality. We cannot conceive of Christ having any shadow of doubt of a life beyond death. If we ask why it was so, we further see that it was because it was impossible for him to doubt the existence of God, the ever-living, God, the ever-loving. This is the order or conviction in us all. It is vain to try and build up a faith in immortality by natural arguments, or even by what Scripture records. As the great preacher Horace Bushnell once said, in truth, the faith of immortality depends on a sense of it begotten, not on an argument for it to be concluded. This sense of immortality is begotten when a man is truly born again, instinctively feeling himself an heir of things beyond this world, into which his natural birth has ushered him, when he begins to live in God, when the things of God are the things amongst which and for which he lives, when his spirit is in daily and free communication with God, when he partakes of the divine nature, finding his joy in self-sacrifice and love, in whose purposes and dispositions can be exercised in any world where men are, and with which death has no conceivable relation. But on the other hand, for a man to live for the world, to steep his soul in carnal pleasures, blinding himself by highly esteeming what only belongs to the earth, for such a man to expect to have any intelligent sense or perception of immortality is clearly out of the question. Another question, however, is sure to be asked at this point. What was the experience of Lazarus during these 4 days? To speculate on what he may have seen, heard, or experienced, to trace the flight of his soul through the gates of death to the presence of God, may perhaps seem to some as foolish as to go with those curious Jews who flocked out to Bethany to set eyes upon this marvel, a man who had passed into the unseen world and yet returned. But although no doubt good and great purposes are served by the obscurity that involves death, our endeavours to penetrate the gloom and catch some sort of glimpse of a life we must shortly enter cannot be judged altogether idle. Unfortunately, however, there is little we can learn from Lazarus. 2 English poets, the one fitted to deal with this subject by an imagination that seems capable of seeing and describing whatever man can experience, the other by an insight that instinctively apprehends spiritual things, and both by reverential faith, have taken quite opposite views of the effect of death and resurrection upon Lazarus. The one describes him as living henceforth a dazed life, as if his soul were elsewhere, as if his eye, dazzled with the glory beyond, could not adjust itself to the things of earth. He is out of sympathy with the ordinary interests of men, and seems to live at cross purposes with everything around him. This was a very inviting view of the matter for a poet, but here was an opportunity of putting in a concrete way an experience unique. It was a task worthy of the highest poetic genius to describe what would be the sensations, thoughts and ways of a man who had passed through death and seen things hitherto invisible, and been exalted above measure, becoming certified by face-to-face vision of all that we can only hope for and believe in, and had yet been restored to earth. This opportunity of contrasting the paltriness of earth with the sublimity and the reality of the unseen was too great to be resisted. the opportunity of flouting our professed faith by exhibiting the difference between it and the real assurance, by showing the utter want of sympathy between one who had seen and all others on earth who had only believed. This opportunity was too inviting to leave room for a poet to ask whether or not there was a basis in fact for this contrast, whether it was likely that in point of fact Lazarus did conduct himself, when restored to earth, as one who had been plunged into the full light and thronging of the unseen world. When we consider the actual requirements of the case, it can only seem highly unlikely that Lazarus had been recalled from a clear consciousness and knowledge of the heavenly life. Unlikely that he should be summoned to live on earth with a mind too large for the uses of earth, overcharged with a knowledge that he could not even begin to think of using, as a poor man suddenly enriched way beyond his ability to spend, and therefore, as a result, only confused and stupefied. In all probability, he had nothing to reveal, for as Jesus said, he came to awake him from sleep. Had he learnt anything of the spirit world, it would have been left behind. The burden of a secret which all men craved to know, which the scribes and lawyers from Jerusalem would do all in their power to elicit from him, would have damaged his mind and oppressed his life. His rising would be as the awaking of a man from a deep sleep, scarcely knowing what he was doing, tripping and stumbling in the grave clothes, and wondering at the crowd. What Mary and Martha would prize would be the unchanged love that shone in his face when he saw them, the same familiar tones and endearments that showed how little change death brings, how little rupture of affection or of anything good, how truly he remained their own dearest brother. To our Lord himself, it would no doubt be a grace that so shortly before his own death, and in a spot so near where he himself would be buried, he should be encouraged by seeing a man who had been 3 days in the grave rise at his word. The narrative of his last hours reveals that such encouragement was not useless, but for us it has a still more helpful significance. Death is a subject of universal concern. Every one of us has to deal with it, and in the presence of it, every man feels helpless. Nowhere do we come so close to the limit and end of our power as at the door of a vault. Nowhere is the weakness of man so keenly felt. There is the clay, but who will find the spirit that dwelt in it? Jesus knows no such sense of weakness. Believing in the fatherly and undying love of his eternal God, he knows that death cannot harm, still less destroy the children of God. In this belief, he commands back to the body the soul of Lazarus. Through the ear of the dead and laid aside body, he calls to his friend and bids him return from the unseen world. Surely we also may say with himself, we are glad that he was not with Lazarus in his sickness, that we might have this proof that not even death carries the friend of Christ beyond his reach and power. Surely there is no one amongst us who can look upon this scene with indifference, for we all have to die, to sink in utter weakness past all the strength of our own, past all friendly help of those around us, of any doctors or whatever research or whatever has been trained upon us. It must always remain a trying thing to die. And in the time of our health we may say, since nature's works be good and death serves as nature's work, why should we fear to die? But no arguments would make us indifferent to the question at death. Are we to be extinguished or to live on in a happier, fuller life? If a man dies in faultlessness, with no forecasting or foreboding of what is to follow, he can give no stronger proof of thoughtlessness. If a man faces death cheerfully through natural courage, he can furnish no stronger evidence of courage. If he dies calmly and hopefully in faith, surely this is faith's highest expression. If it is really true that Jesus did raise Lazarus, then a world of depression, fear and grief is lifted from the heart of man. That very assurance is given to us which we most of all need. And so far as we can see, it is our own imbecility of mind that prevents us from accepting this assurance and living the joy and strength it brings. If Lazarus was raised by Christ, then Christ has that power in which we can safely trust, and life is a thing of permanence and joy. If a man cannot determine for himself whether this actually did happen or not, he must think, I fear, that the fault is his, and that he is defrauding himself of one of the clearest guiding lights and the most powerful determining influence we could ever have. The miracle is perhaps more significant than the explanation of it. The act which embodies and gives fact to a principle is its best exposition. But the main teaching of the miracle is announced in the words of Jesus. I am the resurrection and the life. In this statement, two truths are contained. One, that resurrection and life are not only in the future, but also present. And two, that they become ours by union with Christ. Resurrection and life are not blessings laid up for us in a remote future. They are current. When Jesus said to Martha, your brother will rise again, she answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Meaning that this was some small consolation to her right there and then. There was her brother lying in the tomb dead, and there he would lie for years, centuries, millennia, dead. No more to move about in the home she loved for his sake. No more to exchange with her one word or look. What comfort did the vague and remote hope of reunion after long millennia of untold change bring? What comfort is to sustain her throughout her own remaining life? When parents lose the children whom they could not bear to have for a day out of their sight, whom they had longed for if they were absent an hour beyond their time, it is no doubt some comfort to know that one day they will again hold them next to their chest. But this is not the comfort that Christ gives Martha. He comforts her not by pointing out to her a far-off event which was vague and remote, but to his own living person, whom she knew, saw, and trusted. And he gave her that assurance that in him was both resurrection and life. Therefore, all who belonged to him were uninjured by death, and had in him a truly present and continuous life. Christ then does not think of immortality in the way that we do. The thought of immortality is with him involved in and absorbed by the idea of life. Life is a present thing, and its continuance a matter of course. When life is full and abundant and glad, the present is enough, and the past and future are unthought of. It is life, therefore, rather than immortality that Christ speaks of. A present thing and not a future one. Good, an expansion of now, which necessarily carries with it the idea of permanence. Eternal life he defines not as a future continuance to be measured by ages, but as a present life, to be measured by its depth. It is the quality but not the length of life that he looks at. Life prolonged without being deepened by union with the living God is no boon. Life with God, in God, must be immortal. Life without God he does not call life at all. In evidence of this present continued life, Lazarus was called back and showed to be still alive. In him the truth of Christ's words was exemplified. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall live, and whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. He will doubtless, like all men, undergo the change that we call death. He will become detached from the present earthly scene, but his life in Christ will suffer no such interruption. Dissolution may pass on his worldly body, but not on his life. His life is laid and hid with Christ in God. It is united to the unfailing source of any and all existence. Such life, now abundant and ever more abiding, Christ affords to all who believe in him. To Martha he intimates that he has the power to raise the dead, that this power is so much his own that he needs no instrument or means to apply it, that he himself, as he stood before her, contained all that was necessary for resurrection and life. He suggests this, but he also suggests much more than this. That he had the power to raise the dead, it would, no doubt, revive the heart of Martha to hear. But what guarantee, what hope was there that he would, in fact, exercise that power? And so Christ does not say, I have the power, but I am. Is Lazarus joined to me? Has he attached himself confidingly to my person? Then whatever I am finds exercise in him. It is not only that I have this power to exercise on whoever I may, but I am this power, so that if he be one with me, I cannot withhold the exercise of that power from him. They who have learned to obey Christ's voice in life will quickly hear it and recognize its authority when they fall asleep in death. They who have known its power to raise them out of spiritual death will no doubt its power to raise them from bodily death to a more abundant life than this world affords. They once felt as if nothing could deliver them. They were dead, deaf to Christ's commands, bound in bonds which they thought would hold them until they themselves should rot away from within them. They were buried out of sight of all that could give spiritual life, and the heavy stone of their hardened heart will lay upon their ruined and outcast condition. But Christ's love sought them out and called them into life, assured that he has the power to do this, conscious in themselves that they are alive with a life given by Christ. They cannot even begin to doubt that the grave will be just a bed of rest, and neither things present nor things to come can separate them from a love which has already shown itself capable of the very utmost.